good evening. Wow, lots of people and people up there. Amazing. So what I'd like to talk about this evening is out-of-body experiences. It's probably the best experience any one of us could have in a lifetime. At least that's what people who had one talk about, and that's how it has felt. And actually there's 5% of the population who will have one or two out-of-body experiences in a lifetime. So there should be plenty of people in here. Maybe just normally ask this at the end, but who had an out-of-body experience in here already? Okay, not bad. Normally, I always ask this, and then there's a few hands going up, and later on after the talk, there's about twice as many, because people don't really like to talk about it. So out-of-body experiences, they have existed since time immemorial. They have always been around. Strikingly or strangely, it's only for about 20 years that there is research about it. And of course, people have collected histories for a long time about it. But the way we look at it, I'm a neuroscientist by training and a medical doctor, so those are about a couple of aspects I want to talk about. Very, very briefly, why from a scientific point we look at them. Of course, a phenomenon is a phenomenon, and as a scientist, I can be interested in just understanding how it happens, and that could be it. But I think they reveal really what puts the self, or what puts the center of awareness inside the body in the first place. So what is it in the brain that makes sure that all of us feel more or less that there's something in our bodies and looking out? So I think it teaches us about what this is. But the main part, so 2 will be what is known very, very briefly about out-of-body experiences in the general population. And then we look at a few cases in the hospital, in neurology, epilepsy patients mostly, who had a few of these out-of-body experiences, some very specific ones. And then we go towards more recent experiments we've started in order to see, can we induce similar states experimentally in research settings and also maybe in other settings for meditation, facilitation, or well-being. Anyway, as I said, so this is it. So what's the self? We all know it, but it has been, of course, traditionally been very, very hard to define. It's something very old, since at least the time of Aristotle. There's aspects like, I seem to be in direct contact with the self. I am the self. It's almost like nonsensical to say this, but this is really what the eye of conscious experience, the self, is about, and it's the subject of experience. If I look at the red light over there, I am the subject of seeing that red light. So what's this I? And why is this I somehow experienced, linked to my body? It is an embodied form of the subject. And there are many of these aspects, and as is clear also in out-of-body experiences, maybe we get to this in the question session, somehow this self seems to be linked to the soul. So there's the mind-body dualism. So if the self is outside the bodily borders, what does this mean? Can my brain be the one organ causing consciousness, or is it rather something separate? So the out-of-body experience have always been taken as examples, as direct evidence that the self is more than just brain activity. But the definition that you can find and that I want to start with, and you can see it here in this drawing by Escher. I don't know if you can see it. So it's really about this entity. So this is Escher's left hand. He's holding the mirror ball in a way, and he sees a reflection of himself. But it's not about the image of Escher that I want to talk about in out-of-body experience, but rather what's this entity looking? The first-person perspective directed at this autism. So the self is distinct from the physical environment. It's also distinct from other people. And the really fun aspect of studying the self is that this is this entity. If I have a perception of the redness over there, this is my hand movement. It's the self-ascription. Perceptions, actions, and even thoughts are ascribed to this self. And that's the entity we would like to understand if we want to understand the self. And this is the key distortion that happens during an out-of-body experience, because the self is not experienced as here anymore, but it would be if I were to have one right now here, would be floating under the ceiling and looking down. The self has been studied also by cognitive neuroscientists over the last 30 years. You can study this by looking at autobiographical memory. The last time I have been in Copenhagen, the first time I have been in Copenhagen, this is part of the self, this is part of me. I know this was me who was here, but it's not the memory part that interests us, it's more what is important for out-of-body experience, the experiential part of it. How did it feel like to be the self at that particular moment? And how can it be that I know that it was really me the last time? And then there's other aspects. But what I will argue, apart from these, and this is really the research on out-of-body experiences that has led to this conclusion. It's almost the conclusion of the talk, if you want. Otherwise, we'll really talk more about out-of-body experiences. Is that there's a low-level information of bodily representation, of bodily signals, my hands, seeing the hands, feeling the hands, moving the hands, hearing the hands. Automatic integration of these kind of signals are, as I will argue tonight, are the most fundamental mechanisms that a short disruption of this integration leads to out-of-body experience. And the last introduction slide, what I think out-of-body experiences are really related to a phantom limb sensation. But we conceptualize out-of-body experience as a generalized phantom limb sensation. Not a phantom limb sensation just of an arm, but a generalized phantom limb sensation. You all familiar with phantom limbs? So after amputation, so upper right limb in this gentleman here, there is the residual limb, but 95% of healthy people suffering this will experience the persistence of a phantom limb. So it's a normal brain response. And so is the out-of-body experience. But it's not a phantom limb, it's a generalized phantom sensation of an entire body. And so, so this is, in this case here, this patient perceives actually a flesh-like, a hand which is in a particular position. There's no forearm, but there's the distal part of the hand, and it feels exactly as the hand that is still physically existing, which is also something you find in out-of-body experience, that the self is experienced as strongly as under normal conditions. And so, but what we know is that reorganization in the left part of the brain representing that hand, which is of course completely unaffected by the amputation, is causing the phantom limb sensation. And why is it, maybe that's also something we can discuss, why is it so easy for us to accept, yes, phantom limb, we understand. It's just an arm representation and the person feels that there's an arm. Of course, there is no arm, but we believe him. But when the same individual would tell us, well, I actually feel to be 3 meters up higher and to be looking down, why would we say we don't believe, or we make this a much more special experience than experiencing just a phantom limb? We think that they're really very closely related. So here's an example, one of the first description from a fantastic book that Sylvain Muldoon has written together with Herbert Carrington. There's where Sylvain Muldoon, that you see an image here, is describing his over 100 out-of-body experiences that he had. And he does not just describe them, he also analyzes them, and he comes up with a core out-of-body experience. So the key element is really the separation, as I said, of the physical body is here, and then there is this elevated body position. So the self does not feel embodied, but it is disembodied, always at a very typical location, namely here, 2 to 3 meters above the physical body. In this room, more or less under the ceiling. What you also see is that there's a 180-degree inversion. So the subject is lying on his back, so you don't feel to be elevated and looking at the ceiling, but you're also rotated, or you feel to be rotated. Your subject of awareness, self-consciousness, is rotated by 180 degrees and experiences to be looking down in this direction. So there's also, just like our consciousness right now, subjectivity is directed towards the world, but in this case, rotated with respect to the physical body. The large majority of really 90% have exactly this. And then a third element, which is really striking,
I don't know, we can discuss it who had an out-of-body experiences before, but you see your own body lying on bed, for example. So you're under the ceiling, you're away from your body, but at the same time you also see your body. For many individuals, that's the key element, that you must be out of your body. How can you otherwise see your body from a distance? The question is, what is out of the body, of course, and what generates this in the brain? So this is, these are Sylvain Muldoon's own words. So by the way, so written in 29, he was 25 at the time. Very typical, the way he describes it here as well, is that he's waking up from sleep. Very typical response or situation in healthy subjects experiencing and reporting out-of-body experiences. There was a feeling of heaviness and of adhering to the bed, so a sense of gravity, of being stuck to the bed, which was followed by very rapid small amplitude movements, vibrations of his body going up and down. So these vibrations and a very slow elevation that followed, and he kept he experienced some form of vertigo or balance difficulties. And the out-of-body experience comes then. I think this is the only longer text that I have. I was floating, so this elevation sensation continues. I was floating in the air, horizontal, a few feet above the bed. The room, and that's the striking thing for Muldoon here, everything was just like under normal conditions. Although he is elevated, he sees the entire room just like as if he were at his physical position. His location and the elements in the room were normally perceived. It was hazy at first, but was becoming clearer as I was moving towards the ceiling, horizontal and powerless. So it's a passive sensation of displacement. And of course then, the first time, this is his first out-of-body experience, he somehow managed to turn around, this 180-degree inversion, and was quite perplexed that he saw a second body. So he felt the body with him to be under the ceiling, but he saw his own body. There was another body, another me, so the I is under the ceiling, the me, the object of his body is quietly on the bed. It's not just Sylvain Muldoon, it's probably the most famous and most cited book, but there's also Oliver Fox from the UK and Robert Monroe, who even started his own institute in order to teach people how to induce out-of-body experiences. So if you're interested, these are all, I think, quite good reads. But they're self-descriptions. And so in science, you can't really work much with self-descriptions because they could just be reflecting the individual's personality-related aspects rather than something more general about out-of-body experiences. This is one of my favorite books, Celia Green, who collected 300 cases and observations in the UK on out-of-body experiences. And you see that what this English person described is very much like what Sylvain Muldoon described. I was asleep on a settee, on a bed with my wife. I was aware at one stage that I was out of my body, poised 6 feet or so above the bed, and looking down at the two of us on the bed. So again, the same idea. Distant, disembodied, rotated, and to be looking down and to see yourself. And it even, obviously, can also affect neuroscientists or neurophysiologists. Marvin Minsky, for those who study computer science, a very prominent figure of artificial intelligence and telepresence, also described openly his out-of-body experience at the age of 17. So there is much work collecting case histories like this. There's also questionnaire studies that have been done by these psychologists. And what these data show is that's a frequent experience. As you've seen here, there's quite a few people in the audience who have the experience. 5% may be a little bit high, so it's the actual numbers may be 2 to 5%. However, it is rare. So this means millions of people worldwide, right? Really a huge number of people who will have out-of-body experiences. But it's only once or twice in a lifetime in most individuals. 99% is the number. And it's worse, the ones who can induce it, it's extremely rare, so you never know in the sense when it's going to hit you. It comes spontaneously in a way. So it's really, really hard to get experimental data or research data on this. So here, again, the definition. It's kind of funny talking about out-of-body experiences and drinking a drink called Black Hole, but it's really good. So there's extracorporeal self-location or disembodiment. So the self is localized outside the bodily boundaries. This is what gave the experience the name. There's also a disembodied first-person perspective. This is, I'm not just out of the body and I see the world from where I should see the world from my physical eyes, but I see the world from my mental eyes, which travel, if you want, to this elevated location. And then there is self-identification with this elevated position. Okay, so I think I've mentioned this. So what intrigued me? So how did I get into this topic, by the way? So so I was a medical doctor, neurologist at the time, and one of my supervisors had worked on out-of-body experiences before. So he had given me some of these papers, and he told me basically, well, if you come across some of these cases, it may be interesting to look more carefully at this. And by chance, in this particular unit I was working on, there were actually quite a few cases where and opportunities to see, is a certain brain structure linked to out-of-body experience, or is it just anywhere in the brain where this could happen? And this is what I want to talk about next. If we talk about out-of-body experiences where, although we know by now they exist in the general population, they're quite frequent. If you have an out-of-body experience, this does not mean you are a neurological patient or a psychiatric patient or whatever patient. It's 5% of the population, so the brain reacts like this, just like in phantom limbs. But nevertheless, they can sometimes also occur, like any experience, due to a brain disease. And these are the next cases that I want to present. So one of, I don't know if you can see this, but there is this one spot here, which is a little bit wider than on the other side. It's also not here, it's one particular part of the brain. And if you look at electrical activity of the brain, there is these spike-like structures that you see also here, and they are predominating in this blue region here. The nose is here, the two ears would be here, so it's a region somewhere over the right hemisphere. And people have looked, that was the starting point, so to speak, that in some individuals, if you had a complex partial seizure with loss of consciousness, prior to this, some patients reported also that they had an out-of-body experience. We were able, this is one of those first patients we studied in Geneva, suffering from a severe form of epilepsy, where we, for medical reasons, implanted these electrodes. And so each of these lines here that you can see is one implanted electrodes. There were 64 implanted here over the cortical surface by a neurosurgeon. And here we had the opportunity to localize this much more precisely. So again, a patient where due to a seizure, due to epilepsy, before there is a loss of consciousness, there was an out-of-body experience. And so it allows us, for the neuroscientist, very important, to link it to a certain brain structure. And you see these black lines. This is the parietal cortex. The temporal cortex is a memory structure. This is a space perception structure, a visual structure. Sound cortex is here. So it seems to be an area that's in between these different areas, analyzing information from the different senses. However, it is just, well, this structure could be related to epilepsy. The difference here was also previous cases. It was just one or two seizures of this patient who had been associated with an out-of-body experience. And in this patient, we recorded the seizure while the patient was in the hospital. So, and these discharges, if you want, were associated with the out-of-body experience. However, these could again just be several cases. So it's not clear whether it's specific for these brain regions. What we looked at next is, and these are 9 different patients, and each of the brain disease affected those areas that you see in color. And we could now do a kind of simple analysis, if you want. If we average all these brain regions, would one particular regions pop up? Or would several regions be coming up? And what we found in this analysis is that in particular the red and the yellow region is the region where most of these patients had a brain interference. And that could be migraine, epilepsy, or I think we had also stroke patients here. vascular stroke. So it can be quite serious diseases, but if they affect this part of the brain, no out-of-body experience, this part, no out-of-body experience. Only if they interfere with this region, there seems to be, or there can be an out-of-body experience as a consequence. So the question, of course, is, well, it's not a region in the brain for out-of-body experiences unless we can come up with a reason why, as humans, we should have it. But since we have it so rarely, so what I'd like to discuss with you today is rather a region whose activity is there to put us inside our body. Right? It's a region that puts consciousness into the body in the first place, because it's a thing the brain has to calculate. It's not by definition that consciousness is localized here. It could be localized anywhere. And so, if there is a problem in this region, consciousness and the self does not seem to be represented in the brain, but rather at a very particular location, 2 to 3 meters above, and looking down. I think 2 weeks ago, at least those who have been here, this image was also shown. This is another patient where this link between this brain region and out-of-body experiences became clearer. And this is again like a medical test we can discuss in an epilepsy patient. The epileptic focus was here, so seizures in this particular patient started here. And when we stimulated electrically, putting very mild currents into these regions, people were having auditory sensations. They were hearing different kinds of sounds. However, when we stimulated at the blue region here, light blue region here, we got these different responses. The first very small responses were just, initially the patient reported a sliding sensation. So she was on the bed, 3 people around her, she receives the current, she doesn't know when the current is coming, but she felt she was sliding direction of her feet towards the lower end of the bed. Each time we put a current, she felt this. To look, so it was like, let's say, 2.5 milliamps. When we went to 3 milliamps as a current, so we went slightly higher, the patient felt to be somewhere else, sort of in a black hole, and to be just falling. Sensation of pure falling, nothing else. No visual sensations, just pure falling. And these are responses, they're not auditory responses, you don't hear anything, but it's another part of that same nerve coming from the inner ear, which is the sense of balance. So we classified initially this response as balance, and we almost wanted to already stop recording here, but we decided to confirm this effect one more time, and we went up with the current, and it is at that point that she hesitated quite a bit. And there's actually quite a number of, all these sites were stimulated. There's quite a large number of quite strange experiences and discussions that occur in this setting. But she's like, I'm not really sure what happened. Could you stimulate one more time? It seems like I'm looking at you guys from above the ceiling. And we're like, sure. Why not? And we weren't, of course, sure, because she never knows when we apply the small current. So we this time paid a little bit more attention, and we really looked, so tell us exactly when it happens, and describe it, etc. And it was really each time we put this current into this particular region there, that she said it became clearer, and she could describe it quite well. It was exactly like Sylvain Muldoon had described. So she felt under the ceiling. It was actually quite precise. She felt like she almost could touch the ceiling with her back. But of course, she was lying on her back, but she felt to be touching the ceiling. She saw us 3 sitting around her bed. What was really strange for her, which also is not very frequently reported, that she only saw her legs on the bed. So the patient felt to be elevated, but she only saw the lower parts of her body from the elevated perspective. But she also had the clear sensation to see the world from this elevated perspective. Now, these stimulations are only 2 seconds, so it was really like turning on and off a light switch to turn on and off the light. In this case, the out-of-body experience. So the first finding that was different than previous findings is not just about the location, which is exactly in the same brain location like the data I showed you on the slide before. So the region is really within this if you just compare it. But the first link is this link to vestibular system. So there seems to be an association, the same cortex, the same brain region, just after the auditory cortex, which is a balance cortex, is involved in out-of-body experience. So it is a link to body representation, and the vestibular sense is important. However, these sensations, so this was a clinical test, so we couldn't really do a lot of experiments. So we just decided to do a few more tests, and what we tried to do is what happens now if she would look, because it was so weird that she saw only half of her body from the elevated perspective. So we asked her during stimulation what would happen if she would this time look at her legs. So she's lying in bed, like in this position, a little bit more upright, and she would just fixate her legs. And what happened then is, I think, interesting and important for understanding what out-of-body experiences are, because during the stimulation, she felt a shortening of her legs, and once the stimulation was over, her body or her feet was basically jumping back. It's like a Tom and Jerry kind of thing where you feel your legs shortened and they come back. And if we changed input, so changing leg position also changed what she experienced. So if we asked her to bend her knees, can't do this after this drink anymore. So if she looked at her legs like this and we stimulated, actually the legs were coming towards her face, and she was trying to put her face in a safe position. Of course, nothing ever moved physically, but she had these strong, vivid sensations that her body was moving. And if she was closing her eyes during the stimulation, she actually felt to be doing a sit-up. So what is important here, each time we change how the brain perceives signals from the body, this is somehow integrated into the altered own body perception. So we think that out-of-body experience are also an altered own body perception caused by this by a short-lasting deficit or change in integrating different pieces of information. If you think about your hand, the example I gave before, you see the hand, you can move the hand, you feel the position of the hand. All this needs to be integrated into one single representation. But if this integration breaks down, you may have two representations, a movement representation over here and a visual representation over here. And the brain is not able to fuse them. And we think that something similar is going on for the out-of-body experience, but not for the arm, but for the full body. How am I doing with time, actually? Okay. So these clinical data, in particular the last observation, I think makes a very strong case that out-of-body experiences are really something like phantom limb sensations, but not a phantom limb, but a phantom body sensation, and that they're an illusion of how the brain perceives a person's body. The brain damage data are pretty clear. It points to one region, which, by the way, is known to be a center of integrating this information. And then in a more detailed fashion, there seem to be two disintegrations going on. One between seeing your hand and where your balance system tells you where the hand is, and then these other types of integration. So for the specialists and for questions, we can go into this. And interaction of this same brain system in healthy subjects outside of the neurology clinic, during dreams, during other parts of sleep, or other aspects, if there is an interaction with this region, could also explain the out-of-body experience in healthy subjects. Okay, so far so good, but how do you do research with this? So as a research scientist, you can kind of write research grants and ask for funding or start a PhD project, and then say, well, we're going to sit in the clinic and we're going to wait until the next patient walks in, especially if there's only I think 15 that I've come across in Geneva at the Geneva University Hospital in 10 years. So you're not very likely to get funded. So we did this anyway. So we always kept, of course, waiting and distributed this information. But we wanted to establish something where we can move forward and maybe induce similar states in the research lab. And we called the research project Video Ergo Sum, based on an older form, of course, Cogito Ergo Sum from Descartes, using video technology and also the aspect of seeing your body at a different place than you really are. And we exploited again illusion settings that were based from phantom limb phenomena, but also from experimental procedures called the rubber hand illusion. Again, researchers have been fascinated by testing how fingers are represented in the brain, how the hand is represented in the brain, but much less people have studied how the full body or the trunk or the head are represented in the brain. But that's exactly the system we need to understand out-of-body experiences, we think. So phantom limbs I've already presented to you. It's a feeling as if that limb that is not physically existing still exists. However, there have been data by Ramachandran, so you see the left residual limb here. This is a mirror that's actually interposed between the residual limb and the physically existing hand. And then, of course, what Ramachandran showed is if you superimpose your reflected right hand, which turns into a mirror left hand, over the non-existing left hand, this comes with changes for the phantom limb. So if you have a painful phantom, for example, and you overlay your physically existing hand over the painful phantom hand, this in some patients can alleviate pain. So it shows that even phantom limbs are based on integration of visual and bodily touch or feeling systems. But this is basically, I'll just show this video here. This is a research paradigm that's very closely based on this. So this is the experimenter, this is the experimental subject. I play it again. It's much better with sound, but I just play it one more time here. So the guy in the blue shirt is the subject, and he doesn't see his left hand. He feels, of course, his left hand, but there is a precluding screen. So he doesn't see his real hand, but he sees this ridiculously looking fake hand, this pink kitchen glove on the left. And the experimenter applies touch, stroking to this hand, but also to the hidden hand. And he does this synchronously in order to make an association, in order to trick the brain into believing that this hand is his real hand. And you can see that the stroking is synchronously. Okay? He's not so sure whether this is so funny, but... And don't ask me how one gets ethics approvals for these kind of experiments. But, so the aggression was coming from here, and he doesn't pull away this hand. He actually pulls away this hand first. And the aggression, of course, came from here, but it was directed at this, and he pulls away this hand because in this illusion setup you create a false assimilation of this hand into his brain representation, if you want. So otherwise, if it's a general fear response, of course he should have pulled away this hand. And believe it or not, on this illusion there's about 60 papers published by respected scientists. And it is a nice illusion allowing to show how visual input, this is the pink hand being stroked, proprioceptive information about limb position, and touch information that you receive, that you also feel, is integrated. How is this integrated to create one left hand representation? And if you apply the stroking synchronously, these two illusions can be induced. So once you feel that the touch, there is illusory touch, you start feeling the touch where you see the touch, not where you should feel it. So the touch is felt at the pink glove, and also the position of the pink glove feels like it is your own hand. So there's an ownership for this. And then an important thing for us in the lab to measure, we don't just give questionnaires, but if after the illusion, so this is the real hand, the fake hand is here, you ask the subject in the blue t-shirt to point towards the hand, towards the index finger. They don't point here. They point to a position between the pink hand and the other hand. So the brain, after 2 minutes of stroking, immediately recalibrates where the physical hand is. But again, for the out-of-body experience, really we had to change this illusion because the entity, the self, is not changed, right? It's just the hand towards me which is changed. What we would like to change is where is this I with respect to the body. So this is the video ergo-zoom setup that we came up with. So this is our experimental subject, is wearing a head-mounted display that you can see here. And he only sees what the camera sees, positioned 2 meters behind him. So he sees his own body, a virtual body if you want, standing in front of him. And then, very much like in the rubber hand illusion, we apply the touch cue, the stroking here. And so, if you feel in this illusion the stroking here, you see it 2 meters in front. And we also did this for 2 minutes, the same protocol like the rubber hand illusion, and we looked and we were able to induce similar changes. First of all, I think this is what it looks like. So the subject here sees what the camera sees, so it's the stroking you see here, but you actually feel it at the position here, and we also get those 2 changes. So you feel the touch actually here and not here, and you self-identify with this avatar of virtual body. So after 2 minutes of stroking, your brain starts to believe and to feel that the body is actually here and not here, and this is shown here on the left. And we have very simple control conditions, for example. So this is the same synchronous stroking condition. The touch is applied at the same time that you see it. If you add a small delay between the camera and the recording, then this illusion breaks down. And if afterwards, so we couldn't simply ask subjects to point towards the fake body because that doesn't change. But after the illusion, remember the avatar was 2 meters in front, Binya displaced the person, and then the task was simple. Just walk back to the position where you have been standing. But people walk too far in the sense that they get it wrong where their center of awareness was during the experiment. So they were shifted, I think by 30 centimeters in this project towards the avatar's position. So in a sense, the experimenter predicts more accurately where an individual subject localizes his or her center of awareness. Yeah, so we also made sure that we could actually induce a rubber body illusion. So remember in the first scenario, we really filmed the subject's own body. So here we filmed a mannequin, like just a fake figure, and applied at the same time the stroking here. So what the subject, which is standing here, sees in this setup is actually this fake body standing in front, but the illusion works in the same way, if not better. We actually wanted to call this rubber body illusion first, but if you do a Google search with that name, you find all sorts of strange websites. So we decided to go for full body illusion in the end. And you will not be surprised, but for experimental psychologists, it's a nice control condition for attention, let's say. So if you replace the fake body by this rectangular shape, no illusion is induced and no change in this drift measurement. Something interesting that we're pursuing also, if you have this illusion, this comes with consequences for your real body. So if during this illusion we apply mild, painful stimuli to the subject's body, you seem to support more pain. So leaving your body in this experimental way seems to change pain perception. Also, as you can see here, in addition, your body seems to start cooling down, which we don't really know why that would be the case. But if your brain believes to be not here, but at another location, it starts to re-attribute sources to other locations. Okay, so these full body or out of body illusions are very close to or have some parts that spontaneously occur in out of body experiences, and people not only self-identify with this avatar, but very importantly localize their center of awareness, just like in out of body experiences, to a position outside the bodily boundaries. So it really shows, and this is that the inside body experience is an active process. So it's not a given that our brain localizes our subject and our individual to the limits of our physical boundaries. So it's an active process that we can break down in these experimental fashions, and that spontaneously occurs in out-of-body experiences. So the last part really that I want to present is like the last step from a neuroscience point of view. So how can we link this yet to brain imaging? So if we induce our illusion in the same way, and now associate this with brain imaging techniques, which brain regions would really become activated? So this way we would have gone full circle from a neuroscientific point of view, just an important achievement. And in a nutshell, we use just a lot of technology to achieve this. I don't know if you've been in a scanner, but there's not a hell lot of place in order to test our illusions. So what we had to build is basically replace the mattress and develop it or change it with an automatic stroking system and a massage system, and you get paid if you participate in these experiments. It's very nice. And then we had also to present our virtual bodies on this system. So there's actually a good friend of mine, a specialized engineer for MRI-compatible robots. So these robots have to be built out of plastic and wood, everything non-material. Sorry, I have to find the video. That doesn't seem to work. Anyway, I just move on. But what you would have seen here is this is the scanner. You see there's not a lot of space, but basically the subject is lying on top of this, and then this robot can basically now automatize the stroking, the scratching, and the back. It's a very simple robot, and at the same time you would be looking up and you would see the similar rubber body type illusion, the same robot applying the stroking. So you see the stroking here visually that you see physically attached. And so what we could induce was in this case really something like out of scanner experiences, because people believed to be first levitated in this case under very predictable positions. This is the same center of awareness. So in the illusion condition, people felt higher, to be elevated higher above the body. And in the white control condition, this was not the case. And then there was this particular group which showed different responses because they also felt to be inverted. So we didn't expect this. The robot was not built at all in this way. But the responses we obtained were very predictable in this sense. So without any experimental conditions, they felt to be elevated and to be looking down. Remember, you are lying in the scanner like this, and you're seeing this body above you. So what these people felt is they saw the same body, but they felt, without the sound, that the body was below them and they were on the top. So very much similar like out-of-body experience, but it seemed to be a personality thing, or personality aspect, which we still have to understand better. But what was important, they felt immediately rotated, and when we induced our illusion, they were basically felt to be closer to the floor. So this is this response. So the responses we obtained in the two conditions actually inverted in a very predictable way, which allowed us really to separate those two groups and the brain activity in two particular brain regions. One is here on the left side, and the same region on the right side really accounted or reflected those changes in self and first-person perspective that we obtained. So you can see this, for example, here, that activity is high in the asynchronous condition when the visual tactile stroking is not aligned, and this completely reverses in the left temporal parietal cortex for the other group. So for the people who felt to be looking down. So again, it may not look like much, but this is like 4 years of work of a number of people just to make sure you get the illusion, you get the stroking right, you analyze the data right, etc., etc. So one comparison we were interested is, you still remember these data. Those are the clinical data where this change or where out-of-body experiences occur spontaneously. And we wanted to see whether this out-of-body illusion that I presented to you activates or recruits similar regions like the out-of-body experience. And this is you can see this here. These healthy subject data, healthy students from our school. So this is the representation you see here when they experience this rotation of the perspective, and these are the patient data. So they're not exactly overlapping, but from a macroscopic point of view, this is extremely similar. So it suggests really, like I argued before, that processing in this region is really fundamental for calculating a basic reference frame or GPS, basically, where the self is with respect to the bodily boundaries. So it's not really Escher, or this kind of image of Escher that shows, I think, nicely what we're trying to study. It's more this Mach picture on the right, which is about this embodied first-person perspective. So what he really looks at, I don't know if you know this picture, but you see the upper part of the eye, you see the nose, you see a visual field of his left eye, the right eye is closed, and you see the body extended. So you do have, and we do all have our body in our visual fields all the time, but the brain needs to decide whether it's my body, whether it's another person's body, in particular for the arms. This is not always clear. Just think about shaking the hand of somebody else. So this is actually quite a complex process that the brain has to solve. Now, what happens during out-of-body experience is that it's not a hand or finger representation, it's basically the head and trunk representation, which are the most central ones. And if we get those wrong for brief moments of time, milliseconds if you want, to a few seconds, then the out-of-body experience is quite a normal response, a form of recalibration where the body is in space. So we started with this very general description of a self, and I've given you our account of the self already, but what we are working towards is that the conscious experience of being somebody is really based on this integration of these signals that I've marked here. The trunk-centered somatosensory systems, I can look for my pointer again, and it's based on really these different modalities: motor signals, somatosensory, vestibular signals, and also visual signals. And these are 4 different parts of the brain, and this region I talked to you about is known for integrating these different senses. And if by any form of disease, or just by short-lasting changes that can occur in all of us, this integration is changed, the brain reacts in a very particular way, which is the out-of-body experience. And then these 2 regions, I mostly talked about the temporal parietal cortex, but there's also a neighboring region called the insula, which is also involved. So how do we move forward with this scientifically? So just 2 points. So what I personally think is that this very low-level account of inside body experience and how it is generated, it's a very primitive form. It's probably the first form of self-consciousness that we have, but we're not the only species. Rodents, monkeys certainly have exactly the same mechanisms at work, so they have self-consciousness in this way. And what I think is that many higher level forms of human forms of self-consciousness related to memory, language, and thinking are based. So this is the basic building block, what we talked about today, for these higher forms of self-consciousness. And this is just very often in consciousness research, people say, we should wait. Self-consciousness is so complex, we should wait until we have understood consciousness, and then we should start studying self-consciousness. I think, as the name says, self-consciousness, visual consciousness, auditory consciousness are all subforms of the larger project consciousness. And I think the access to self-consciousness, at least the way I've described it today, is probably much easier than previously thought. This last one just is an outlook where we're taking this also in forms of maybe technologies. So I think in future communication, some of these techniques I've presented to you could be interesting, where there's actually several projects using virtual reality, but also other wearable technologies, mobile phones. We use this very much for chronic pain treatments. I've mentioned the brief effects that you can alleviate pain quite quickly after 2 minutes of stroking. So there are many chronic conditions of pain where some of these virtual reality treatment could be very easily added. And then maybe, something we should discuss more, but wellness and meditation-like approaches could probably benefit if additionally to standard approaches, some of our technologies could be added. Thank you.